Judge Grayson initially assumed he was dealing with an inexperienced teenager until the defendant started dismantling the case with the skill of a seasoned attorney. The atmosphere inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse was heavy, almost stifling. Spectators filled the gallery, whispering among themselves as they watched events unfold. The defendant's table seemed too large for the young man standing beside it, hands in his pockets, chin lifted just enough to show he wasn't intimidated. Jalen Dawson, 19, faced charges of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. Serious accusations, but from the way Judge Walter Grayson looked at him, it was clear the real trial had little to do with the law. Leaning back in his chair, the judge drummed his fingers idly on the polished wood of his desk, peering down at Jalen over the rim of his glasses. His lips curled into something between a smirk and a sneer. "You think you're some kind of legal expert?" he asked, his tone laced with dry amusement. "This isn't a debate club, kid." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom, among the bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor. They were all in on the joke. But Jalen wasn't laughing. He didn't even flinch. He had spent years preparing for this. Not this exact moment, of course. He had never expected to be standing here as a defendant. But he knew the courtroom as well as others knew the basketball court. While his friends memorized game stats, he memorized case law. While they played video games, he played mock trials in his head, arguing cases against himself. His mother, Denise Dawson, had been a paralegal for over 2 decades, and Jalen had grown up listening to her stories, how prosecutors cut corners, how judges showed bias, how some defense attorneys barely put up a fight. He absorbed it all. By 14, he could break down a trial better than most law students, but none of that mattered to Grayson. To him, Jalen was just another troubled kid. "Let's make this quick," the judge sighed, flipping open the case file. "I have a golf game at 2. Laughter rippled through the room again, but this time, something shifted. Jalen's lips twitched into a barely perceptible smirk. Grayson had just made his first mistake. The courtroom hadn't noticed yet. Prosecutor Mitchell Carrington stood, exuding the confidence of a man who had already won. His suit was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted, his voice polished from countless repetitions of the same argument. "Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Jalen Dawson, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle, a 2022 Audi A6, reported missing just hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through downtown, where he allegedly attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The prosecution submits that the evidence speaks for itself." The weight of his words settled over the room. Spectators shifted, murmuring. On the surface, the case seemed airtight. A stolen car, a chase, an arrest. Judge Grayson glanced at Jalen again before turning back to Carrington. "Go on." Carrington strode toward the jury box, the sound of his polished shoes clicking against the floor. "The defense may try to paint this as a misunderstanding, to argue that Mr. Dawson is an unfortunate victim of circumstance." He turned, locking eyes with Jalen for the first time. "But let's be honest. What kind of victim runs from the police?" The tension in the room thickened. Judge Grayson leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. Jalen didn't blink. Carrington continued, flipping through a stack of papers. "Your Honor, I have here the testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. The car was confirmed stolen. The arrest was conducted by the book." Grayson exhaled through his nose, nodding. "Sounds straightforward to me." To most in the room, it probably did. A clear case, stolen car, pursuit, arrest. But Jalen had spent too many years studying trials not to see the weak spots. Still, he remained silent, watching, waiting. Judge Grayson tapped his gavel lightly. "All right, let's hear the defense's response. He turned to Lisa Thornton, the public defender assigned to Jalen, who had barely spoken since entering the courtroom. She rose hesitantly. "Your Honor, my client." Jalen placed a hand on her arm. A silent request. She hesitated, then sat back down. For the first time, Jalen spoke. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." The room fell silent. Grayson stared at him, clearly entertained. "You'll what?" Jalen's voice was steady, unwavering. "I'll be defending myself." A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up. Carrington's smirk wavered for a brief moment before he let out a sharp laugh. "This should be interesting." But the laughter faded as soon as Jalen took his first step forward, because everything was about to change. The weight of the room settled around him as he adjusted his stance, hands still tucked in his pockets. He let the silence linger, stretching just long enough to make them uncomfortable. Then, finally, he spoke. "Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to clarify something with the prosecution." Carrington arched an eyebrow, arms crossed. "Go ahead." Jalen stepped forward deliberately. "You stated that Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before my arrest, correct?" Carrington exhaled, already looking impatient. "That's right. His testimony is in the report." "Of course it is." Jalen nodded, then turned to Judge Grayson. "Your Honor, I move to have that testimony dismissed as evidence." Grayson narrowed his eyes. "On what grounds?" For the first time, Jalen pulled his hands from his pockets and gestured toward the prosecution's table. "Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began." A flicker of confusion crossed Carrington's face. "What are you talking about?" Jalen took another step forward. "Your Honor, I request permission to verify Officer Ruiz's GPS records from that night. If his report states that he witnessed me in the vehicle, his location data should confirm that. But—" he let the word hang in the air. "I have a feeling it won't." The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Grayson frowned, turning to Carrington. "Counselor?" Carrington cleared his throat, his jaw tightening. "That report was filed by an officer of the law, Your Honor. Are we really going to take the word of a defendant over that of a trained professional?" Jalen gave a small, almost indifferent shrug. "If the officer was where he claimed to be, the GPS records will prove it. But if he wasn't—" He let the implication speak for itself. Grayson studied him for a long moment, then shifted his attention back to Carrington. "Does the prosecution have any objection to verifying the officer's GPS data?" Carrington hesitated. Just long enough. The jury noticed, the gallery noticed, and most importantly, Judge Grayson noticed. Jalen took a steady breath. He had spent years watching trials, studying prosecutors, their strategies, the way they maneuvered the system. And one thing was certain. If Carrington were truly confident in his case, he wouldn't be stalling. Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple. "Counselor?" Carrington finally shook his head. "No objections, Your Honor." But the shift had already begun. The laughter had died. The courtroom was silent, but the tension was deafening. Carrington shuffled his papers, the polished confidence he carried beginning to fray. "Your Honor, while we await the GPS records, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle." Jalen gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable. "That's true." He stepped forward. "But let's talk about that evidence for a moment." Grayson gestured for him to continue. Jalen turned toward the jury, locking eyes with each member. "The prosecution wants you to believe that my fingerprints in the car mean I stole it. That's the narrative they're pushing. But let's think about this logically." He took a measured breath, his tone controlled. "Imagine you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up. Then you return it to the rack and leave. Hours later, someone shoplifts that jacket. Does the presence of your fingerprints mean you stole it?" A few jurors exchanged glances. Someone in the gallery muttered under their breath. Jalen didn't give them time to recover. The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven hours before the alleged theft. I was inside that store with 3 friends. And yes, when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door because it was already unlocked. I didn't think much of it. I didn't take the car. I didn't drive it. I didn't steal anything from inside. Just a dumb moment of curiosity. He let that settle. Then, in a voice sharp as a scalpel, he asked, "Does touching something make you a criminal?" Carrington cleared his throat, flipping through his notes, searching for anything to regain control. And while we're on the topic, let's talk about how that fingerprint analysis was actually conducted. He turned to Judge Grayson. "Your Honor, was the forensic specialist who handled this case subpoenaed to testify?" Grayson blinked, caught off guard by the question. He glanced at Carrington, who hesitated before responding, reluctantly. "No." Jalen pressed his lips together. "So let me get this straight. The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual expert who processed that evidence? No chance for me to cross-examine, question the chain of custody, or challenge the accuracy of the analysis?" Carrington's jaw tightened. Jalen nodded, as if that was all he needed to hear. "Interesting." Judge Grayson sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. The look of a man realizing this case wasn't the easy win he had assumed it would be. But Jalen wasn't finished, because what he was about to say next would change everything. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his voice steady but firm. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle." Judge Grayson frowned. "The owner?" Jalen nodded. "Yes. Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the stolen Audi, gave a statement to the police that for some reason was never included in the prosecution's filings. And I think I know why." He turned to Carrington. "Do you recall what Mr. Whitaker told officers the night his car was reported stolen?" Carrington's jaw clenched. He knew exactly where this was going. Jalen didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he pulled out a printed transcript from his file and read aloud. "I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off, but it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Jalen held up the paper. "This is from the original police report, the same report the prosecution conveniently never mentioned." He turned back to Judge Grayson. "The arresting officer left this detail out of his testimony. The prosecution ignored it. And yet, they want this jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even match the description of the actual thief, am guilty beyond a reasonable doubt." Carrington stepped forward, scrambling. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was found in possession of the vehicle." But Jalen shook his head. "Number I wasn't." His voice didn't rise, but it sliced through the courtroom with sharp precision. "I was arrested blocks away from where the car was abandoned, walking home after grabbing snacks with my friends. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. I wasn't running from anything." He let the words settle. "The only thing tying me to this case is sloppy police work and assumptions." Judge Grayson let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple. The case was unraveling, and everyone could see it. Jalen turned back to the jury. The real suspect got away that night. The officers found a black kid in the general area and decided that was close enough. He let that hang in the air before delivering the final blow. That's what this case is really about. Silence. Grayson cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. "Does the prosecution have anything further?" Carrington stood stiff, his face flushed. "No, Your Honor." Judge Grayson exhaled, studying Jalen for a long moment before shifting his gaze to the jury. Finally, he leaned forward and spoke the words that would stay with everyone in that room. Case dismissed. A beat of stunned silence, then chaos. Half the courtroom erupted, some in disbelief, others in quiet relief. The gallery stirred, reporters scribbling in their notebooks. Jalen didn't move right away. He let the moment settle, let reality sink in, for everyone. Judge Grayson, still gripping his gavel, looked at Jalen with an unreadable expression. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Recognition, maybe even regret. Jalen met his gaze for a brief moment, then turned to leave. But just as he reached the door, the judge spoke again. "Mr. Dawson." Jalen stopped but didn't turn. Grayson hesitated, then finally said, "You should consider law school." Jalen smirked. There was nothing to consider, he already knew. Outside the courthouse, the air buzzed with voices. Reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward like weapons. "Jalen, did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What are you going to do next? How does it feel to outmaneuver a seasoned prosecutor?" Jalen pulled his hoodie over his head, ignoring the questions. He wasn't interested in the spectacle. This wasn't about proving how smart he was. It was about something bigger. His mother, Denise, was waiting for him at the bottom of the steps. Her arms were crossed, her face unreadable. For a long moment she'd looked at him. Finally she shook her head and let out a breath. "Boy, you scared me half to death." Jalen chuckled, rubbing the back of his head. "Had to take a risk, Ma." She held his gaze for a moment longer, then pulled him into a tight hug. "You always were the stubborn one." The cameras kept flashing, but Jalen didn't care about them anymore. Across the street, Judge Grayson stood by his car, watching. His posture had changed. The arrogance was gone. His expression was no longer indifferent or amused. It was something else now. Reflection, maybe even realization. He hadn't expected this case to be anything more than routine. Just another defendant, another guilty plea. But now, he knew he'd remember this one. Because Jalen had done something most people never could. He had forced the system to look at itself. And for once, it was the system that flinched first. Here's the real lesson. How many other cases had played out just like this? How many people had been convicted not because of solid evidence, but because of bias, shortcuts, and a system more focused on closing cases than seeking the truth? Jalen had the knowledge to fight back. But what about those who didn't? This wasn't just about one case. It was about all of them. And Jalen knew exactly what he had to do next. This wouldn't be the last time he stood in a courtroom, but next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. He'd be the attorney. And when that day came, he wouldn't be the only one. If this story made you think, even for a second, share it. The justice system is built on laws, but it's run by people, and people can change. But only if we make them. Hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories that matter. Because next time, it might not be Jalen. It might be someone you know.